So I'd like to now take the opportunity to invite Bradley Nolan to the podium. Bradley's the Program Manager for PacWastePlus, the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, or SPREP, to talk about what's happening in the South Pacific. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Shane, and thank you all for coming along. I know it's a very engaging program for these couple of days, so for you all to take your time and hear about what's going on in other parts of the world is great to see. I do feel I've been stitched up a little by Shane. Following our friends from Indonesia is very difficult, and so yeah, you made comment that you have many friends. I can guarantee after your time here, you have made many more. So congratulations on your work, and thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge all of my colleagues from the Pacific Islands and Timor-Leste that have helped with this work. And for those of you who are watching at home, it is 8 degrees here. I left Fiji 4 days ago from 29, so wearing my bula shirt today is a little painful. So just know I'm in solidarity with you all. So I guess very quickly, I am running a project in the South Pacific. We're partnering with 15 countries, so 14 in the Pacific and Timor-Leste as well in the Indian Ocean. We're funded by the European Union for the work that we do, and asbestos is one of 8 waste streams that our project is dealing with. The issues in the Pacific are not dissimilar to what is going on in Australia and what we've heard from Southeast Asia. The numbers are a little different though. You see there's some work that was done in 2017-18. We're just shy of 200,000 metres squared of non-residential asbestos. And this morning I did sit down and read through that report again, and I've just got some other stats that might help provide some context. So large numbers of houses in Nauru and Niue have asbestos containing materials in their building materials. Most of the houses in Niue that have asbestos are abandoned houses, which is a fairly significant issue in many Pacific Island countries. The Cook Islands, Kiribati, Solomon Islands, Tonga and Tuvalu have moderate amounts of asbestos materials in houses. Most of that is in cladding only. Fiji and the Marshall Islands have very limited amounts of asbestos identified, and our friends in the Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, Samoa and Vanuatu have very little asbestos at all. When we actually start looking at what that means, though, we're dealing with another 750,000 metres squared that is spread across a significant portion of the Pacific. The surface area of the moon is less than the size of the Pacific, so we have over 3,000 islands scattered in a very dispersed way with very dispersed population centres, and the cost and the issues to manage all of this is significant. Those countries with the largest amounts of non-residential asbestos of Nauru, Niue, Cook Islands, Tonga and Vanuatu. And in particular, I'd like to bring up Banaba Island on Kiribati, which is a very remote island. It has a significant amount of old damaged asbestos that needs immediate remediation. The issues in Banaba Island, it's about a 40-hour boat ride if you can get good weather. And there's very few people that remain on that island. It is a displaced island. Most of the Banaban population actually live on an island off the coast of Fiji that have been gifted that island from the government because it is unsafe to live there because of the asbestos issues and the old phosphate mining that was going on. We estimate about 10 million USD just to clean up that one community, that one island, and you need to multiply that across the other 3,000 islands, of which some 2,000 are populated. Most of the materials that are identified are non-friable building materials, mainly roofing and external cladding, but the condition of these materials are such that they are considered friable. The predominant form of asbestos is chrysotile white asbestos. So I am happy to say that the Asia Pacific delegation that will be talking at the Rotterdam Convention is pushing for the introduction and inclusion of chrysotile asbestos at the upcoming convention in 2 weeks' time. Like I say, EU funded to try and bring some of those stats into some realm of meaning to you. That light green area that you see is the economic exclusion zones for the countries that are participating. The little specks of red are the actual land masses. Clearly Papua New Guinea is quite significant in amongst the Pacific, but most are small island nations. They are atolls, they are limited land space, limited buildings, limited people, limited funding, and a significant issue. Steve, you mentioned at the start that a lot of our asbestos that is being generated is coming from Russia, and anyone who doesn't think regulation works, our dear friend who you can see on a company logo from Russia, they changed their logo when the person who is depicted there, who I shan't name, changed the legislation to allow asbestos back into America. So, these things have impact. I guess the big thing here is that there is a political driver in the Pacific to move in this space. The work that we have been tasked to do is set by the leaders, the environment ministers and prime ministers of the 15 nations. SPREP, as Shane introduced, actually has 21 members. So all of those countries and territories have committed or have indicated their desire for introducing bans to asbestos importation, use, and transportation. At this stage, no one has succeeded, but I was reviewing some draft legislation for Vanuatu just this week, which will be hopefully bringing in the first importation ban for the Pacific and will lead to larger work. We have had over the last 5 years continual support from the leadership for this work to happen, and my team and I are well on the way to assist our members to do this. We last year at a meeting of our parties, so 26 countries came along. We provided a review that we've done on the legislative frameworks inside of all of our participating countries and designed a legislative pathway, 21 steps, to actually go through a legislative reform process. That process we've actually been able to modify and bring on board for managing other waste streams and implementing sustainable financing systems for waste management, which is a fairly significant issue for all Pacific Islands, and we are looking to move forward with how this works. I'll talk a little bit more about the resources that have been developed, but once again, I think some of the images that we've seen from others paint a bit of a story. So I just wanted to show you a quick 45 seconds of one very small asbestos location in Nauru. I won't talk particularly about where it is, but anyone who understands Australia's relationship with Nauru may well recognise some of this. It's hard not to get overwhelmed when you understand what countries that don't have the resources to deal with these issues are faced with. I guess some of the bigger issues here are Nauru. It's not legal to manage asbestos through landfilling, and in fact, there's only 2 of our countries in the South Pacific that are able to do that. So, how do people deal with it? Other than exactly what you just saw. So there's got to be a number of elements to the approach to managing asbestos as we move through this. We're specifically doing abatement work in a number of countries as part of our project. The legislative work will be assisting all countries along with our communications work, and a big thank you to our friends at ASEA for some assistance that we are receiving and a relationship that has been built there. We're doing asbestos assessment work in a number of countries, and there are some significant challenges even just doing that. Tuvalu is a series of 9 atoll islands. Back in 2017, an assessment was done on Funafuti, the main island, about 10,000 people. We found that 1 in 5 homes had some level of asbestos. The other outer islands, which take about 6 weeks to get a boat to go around and visit, had no assessment done. We do know there's 876 buildings on those 8 islands, and we now need to spend upwards of $60,000 to get a boat to get specialists to go out there and explore and do the assessment of this work. So to even understand the scope of works that needs to happen without spending a cent on abatement at all is a significant impost in the region. I won't go through this slide, but we do have commitments for our work. As I say, we've got 7 countries that are specifically focusing on this work. We're doing a lot of regional work. Every year we are trying to progress this activity, and those of you who work in a legislative environment understand legislation does not come quickly. Try and do that in 15 countries, and I'd love to have you come and join my team. This image here just continues to blow my mind. I won't mention the country this comes from, but anyone who recognises what asbestos powder looks like before it's been formed into anything, derelict building being used as a bike ramp by the local children. There are issues. What we are working on right now, as I mentioned before, is starting to build that momentum on the development of legislative bans. Those countries that we're doing the abatement work in, to receive the support from the European Union, they've had to commit to go through the ban process. So the work that we're doing there will provide that framework for our other member countries to replicate and roll out that work going through. Working with business and community to bring appropriate training, bring that awareness through, and as I say, that work through the legislative framework and the abatement work, the building up of the industry is going to try to provide that sustainability for that work as we move through. Like I said, the leadership is really quite powerful in this space.
Okay, so you should be able to see and hear what's happening in the room now.
I'm glad everyone can see and hear what's happening. So the leadership is looking at that development and implementation of a Pacific-wide ban on the importation, reuse, resale of asbestos-containing materials. The big issue here is there's no such thing as a region-wide ban. What we actually have is 21 sovereign nations that have to go through their own legal process to achieve that. So there is a significant amount of work there. We're looking at how best to achieve this: customs laws, health and safety laws, environment laws, waste management laws, and that recipe that needs to work in each particular country to get the appropriate outcome changes based on their legal framework. Our friends in the North Pacific don't follow the same legislative framework that we do in the South Pacific, which is very Australian, New Zealand centric. Palau, FSM, Micronesia, and others have a legislative process very similar to the United States. So our approach has to change even amongst our own region. Timor-Leste is completely different again. So we've got a lot of complexity. Just to wrap up, we are developing a number of resources. We are hoping to have a bit more of a partnership with ASEA as we move forward, and the education and awareness component of our work will continue. All of this is available on our website, PacWastePlus.org. The final piece of work that I just wanted to mention is that we are working on developing regional template policy for asbestos management and a regional template code of practice that will be embedded in all of these laws that we're working on. So once we work with the industry, build that information and awareness, change that legislation, and then we ensure safe work practice following. like I say, we've got a very strong framework for moving through the legislative process. This will be happening across all 15 countries participating in our project and be available for all 21 in the region. That's enough from me. Apologies if I've gone over time, but thank you all for your attention. Thanks, Shane.
Thanks very much, Bradley. We do have some questions from Lillian. What is the biggest stumbling block to getting national bans on asbestos in Pacific Island countries?
Thanks very much for the question. I'm not sure there's a single stumbling block. The real issue here is the intent exists, the desire exists, but in any legislative process there are people involved. There are processes, there are different agencies, and nothing is quick. The other thing that we know, and we've actually just been having a discussion with our members on this exact question before, and our donor, the European Union, asked this at our annual steering committee meeting last week. What is it now? Why are people interested now that this project's here? And the response was exactly that. This project is here. There is support. There is the regional team that I'm leading, and there is resource that can help countries work through. A number of our countries actually receive legal support through Australia and New Zealand and the federal governments and ministries of foreign affairs and trade. So a lot of the resource doesn't exist inside of our members, and if it does, this is just one small issue in amongst so many others. So having some dedicated support is one of those major issues to achieve this outcome.
Thanks, Bradley. We've still got a little bit of time before the next one's queued up. Has anybody got any questions you'd like to? We'll go to the floor.
You said there was limited areas for burial of asbestos waste. So what's the plan? Where's it going?
I should have just stayed up here, sorry. The plan is to actually start working with countries to look at their legislative processes on how landfill laws and waste management issues are resolved, to look at the possibility for in-country safe disposal and management of asbestos. At this point in time, what needs to happen is appropriate capture, wrapping, storage and shipment to other countries. Exceptionally complex with all of the conventions and exceptionally expensive as soon as you start dealing with not only the process of going through that, but the insurances that come with it. So really trying to look at how that happens. The importation ban is important, not the same issues as what our friends in Indonesia are dealing with, but we did have some work done in 2017-18, abatement work occurring in Vanuatu. At the same time that the trucks were rolling to the port, they were passing hardware stores that were selling new asbestos sheeting. So the reduction of that legacy that can cause that to grow is definitely one of those big issues that we need to deal with. So not sure if I've completely answered the question. There's no simple answer in all of this, but looking at how landfilling occurs, which isn't in many cases, isn't to the normal standards that you see in Australia and New Zealand. There are 214 known landfills in the Pacific. 2 of those are what we would consider Class 1 in Australia. So making sure that we have safe practices before we start looking at in-country disposal is a very important activity.
Thanks. We've got one more question if you... from Terry Ann. We, as in ESRC, previously investigated the issue around asbestos disposal in the Cook Islands with no obvious solution. Is this a consideration in your program?
The simple answer to that is no. Disposal to end of life is not something that our donor is asking us to look at. But effectively, as per the last question, we need to move into that space and look at providing appropriate guidance on how that happens. The specific issues around landfilling in Rarotonga are a little complex. There is some work being done to look at expanding that landfill life and changing those practices. MFAT through New Zealand is providing some particular support to Cook Islands. So the waste management space in the Pacific is really quite complex at this point in time. We did the numbers the other day, and there's at least 18 development partners or partnering countries that are funding some type of waste management work. How do we actually fit infrastructural work for what is core to waste management in amongst the specific waste stream issues that we see with asbestos, organics, anything else, coupled with technology introduction, which is starting to gain a lot of momentum around waste to energy or otherwise, and the philosophical arguments that come from having that happen in small island nations that don't have the funding to do appropriate landfilling, yet how are they going to manage the black box solution that has to be fed, whereas all of the other development support is around reducing the waste to landfill, celebrating traditional practices, and trying to reduce the reliance on the consumption society that West has brought to the Pacific. This is not an easy space by any means, and we're hoping that through the work that we're doing and some partner projects that we can start having appropriate discussions and starting to link work and leverage each other to get an appropriate outcome through region. Thanks, Shane.
Thanks. We've still got a few minutes before we can start the next one, because it is virtual and we've got to queue it up at the right time. So I'll ask for any more questions. Kate was going to ask a question and then we'll come to you.
I feel like I should invite our friends from Indonesia up in case there's any questions for them.
Yeah, look, I didn't catch it, so forgive me if I missed your reference to it, but the questions about alternatives always come up. So perhaps you can, because I noticed that you've got explicit, that the plan is that people can't reuse or resell asbestos-related products. And so where's the debate on about access to alternative products? Thanks.
Yeah.
Because that obviously comes up as a big issue in Southeast Asia as well.
Indeed. It's not so much that we're looking to not allow reuse or resale. What we're looking to do is develop and introduce template codes of practice that will mirror what we're seeing in Australia and New Zealand. We've had a large consultancy piece done looking at codes of practice from countries around the world, and we feel that the activity and the process that has been established for Australia and New Zealand would be suitable for the Pacific. So what we're really looking to do with that reuse and management side of things is to ensure safety. Other than one or two countries, there's not actually asbestos being sold in many of the Pacific Island countries right now. So in terms of an importation ban, I actually think some of the lag on process may well be it's not an urgent issue to ban it because it's just not being sold there. It's just some of the larger countries that have a little bit of support there. So in terms of alternatives, haven't really looked there. Our project isn't focusing in that way. I imagine if they did, we would be looking at those available alternatives that are operating in most Pacific Island countries. And as we are trying to do with all work that we're doing in PacWastePlus, look at that traditional process. What were they using pre-introduction of Western methods? And how can we marry that traditional process, use that traditional knowledge, use those materials in country with modern technology to ensure that it has a longer life, it has a little bit more sustainability without the health issues that come from using products like asbestos or asbestos-containing materials.
I very clearly note the challenges that you've iterated around establishing a legal framework for import prohibitions and subsequent domestic legal frameworks dealing with asbestos in these nations. Has there been any consideration in regards to establishing like a generic framework which could be adopted as a whole, as a collective, but then they essentially individually adopt within their own jurisdictions as sovereign nations?
Yep. Thank you for the question, and essentially that is the work that we're looking to do. So the template policy, the template code, those I think I had on the board, countries like Nauru, Tonga and Kiribati are having very particular abatement work that will be done. Part of the work that we're doing with those countries is using a standardised intent for the ban and actually piloting the implementation of that in each of those countries. So Kiribati has a very different legal framework to the other two. So the outcomes of those three pieces of work will essentially form that, I guess, drafting guidance note that will go to all of our countries underneath the banner of that leadership directive to actually implement this work, and we'll have standardisation throughout the Pacific Island countries on how that rolls out. What we will find, though, I guess, with the code of practice is each country will be able to look at the elements of that piece of work and say what's important to them. So the question before about reuse and the like, it may well be that some countries don't want that at all, so they might strengthen that section, or others don't want to go there and restrict their communities, and they might excise that entirely. But the intent here is definitely do once, use many times. We just need to be very cognizant of the various cultures and processes and systems that exist there. So our job is to guide, it's not to tell ever. And we're working with our members so that this project, which is their project that we're helping facilitate for them, will use the investment of the European Union and our team to actually give them the tools and the resources they need to do it. We definitely don't have the intent to do that 15 times. We don't have the resource to do that. So one of the key things, and I'm sure our friends in Indonesia would agree with, the peer network that exists within the countries in the Pacific is really strong. So working with 2 or 3 countries to implement and to trial and almost use as a pilot will provide the impetus and the encouragement and in fact the justification for many of the other countries to move forward. Externals coming in and saying this is the way it needs to happen is not the best way to go. The peer-to-peer learning and that solidarity that exists throughout the Micronesian, Melanesian and Polynesian countries is one that we are really holding sacred and utilising to best effect. So our support is to merge with that of our members, to enable them to shine and for them to get what they need out of it, and whatever assistance, support or tools or resource that we can provide to help them achieve that is what we're after.
Any special or unique challenges in Timor-Leste?
Timor-Leste is entirely different to every other participating nation. It's quite strange, as Shane mentioned. I work for the Secretary of the Pacific Regional Environmental Program. Anyone who knows a little bit of geography would understand that Timor-Leste is in the Indian Ocean, not the Pacific. So they're not actually a member of the organisation that I work for. But the European Union, our donor, has identified that to provide, to enable them to provide the necessary support, they have included Timor-Leste in the Pacific funding because there's a larger pool of funding as opposed to going into the Asian funding area. So we are finding that everything is much harder because of those differences. Language alone, language is an issue throughout the Pacific. Every country has its own language, but there's similarities through the Pacific with how that works. There are no similarities with our friends in Timor-Leste. Their legislative frameworks are entirely different. And the simple fact is it's a small nation, but there's 1.2 million people in Timor-Leste. We work with Niue that has 1,200 people. So everything about that interaction is entirely different, and we have to have an entirely different approach with our friends in Timor-Leste. On this particular issue, Timor hasn't been all that vocal. They're very much interested in healthcare waste management and trying to improve the 4 hospitals that service 1.2 million people to make sure that they're actually managing that hazardous waste stream and their Stockholm Convention requirements as opposed to this. And unfortunately, with the type of work that we do in development, people do need to focus on those things that are right there. I have no doubt that asbestos is a major issue for them, but it's not something they've asked our project to help them with right now.
Thanks very much, Bradley.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
And thanks everybody for the questions.